G'day and welcome to Does It Matter? Today, I've talked about this topic before, but I want to come at it from a slightly different angle. Recent events are kind of driving the pace of change in terms of technology and employment, and some of you have heard me speak about this ad infinitum. Today, I think I've got a fresh angle on it in this respect. Paradigms tend to shift with technological change, arguably, and there's quite a few scholars who argue along those lines. And in part two of this video, and this is part one, is sort of establishing how we got to where we are now, and what makes us so vulnerable to the coming changes. I'll have some links for you to go and read by some of those scholars concerning some of the perspectives that I'm going to share with you today and in follow-up videos. But today we're going to talk about how we got to the position we're in and why things like pandemics, global catastrophes, world wars, things like that, have a tendency to drive change and disruption at a much faster rate. Some of you probably already know this or have worked it out for yourselves. During recessions, governments typically, and during wars and other great massive catastrophes, there's usually massive amounts of domestic investment in infrastructure, in training, in development, in investment in particular sciences, massively ramped up. We're seeing the same now for the COVID crisis with vaccination and certain types of medicines. We're seeing an absolute flowering of not only new medicines, but the exploration of existing medicines, which are much easier and cheaper and quicker, which is important for the current crisis to develop. So it seems to be a common pattern that we've seen for thousands of years in different cultures, in different types of economic systems. It seems to be one of those universals that happens regardless of whether you're a command and control oligarchy or Soviet top-down or a capitalist system or a mixed economy type system. It doesn't matter. Essentially, certain types of crises and certain types of technological developments have an inevitable effect on the economy. It's not always identical, but it's close enough that we tend to get similar trends, especially over longer periods of time. So because we're getting there is a direct correlation between technological applications and their development and increased economic growth and burgeoning technology. It gives us a clue as what might be coming down the pipe for us, because the forces that were already pushing us towards a global recession, and there was no doubt that we were edging closer and closer, and some countries were already there. Some states in Australia, like I say, were already in recession. We're already edging towards recession, and underneath even America's rallying in the last couple of years, economic rally in the last couple of years, it was a hollow rally, because working hours were not increasing, and even returning factories from Mexico were being highly automated with federal money given by Donald Trump. So one more for the elites, for his elite buddies. Not picking on Donald Trump. Plenty of economic elites and governmental elites have done the same thing, and I'm not sure that they have much choice, to be blatantly honest, but that's for another video. So we were headed towards a downturn of some description. Whether it was going to be a severe recession or a mild one, who knows? We're well beyond that point now. We're going into a severe recession now, possibly worse. And that brings us to the core of what I think establishes the narrative for the next few years. And there are a whole range of other factors like inflation, though they're all related. You know, if you've ever heard of the Phillips curve, do some research on it. It's the relationship between interest rates, employment, and inflation, though it's much more complicated than that. That's the essential core of it. It's become decoupled in recent years for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into in this video. That's a much more complex economic discussion for another time. So we want a definition of work. Work is physical and mental effort or activity directed towards the production or accomplishment of something, okay? Tasks. And the work is the energy exchange. From physics, work is energy to work. It's work as opposed to kinetic energy transfer from one subject A to subject B. So employment is a specific task required to apply work to affect the resulting transfer of energy, production, or value. So I create employment to utilize your energy in a task which will affect or create either more energy if it's a power station, a product, or a service, which all have value, okay, a fictionalized but agreed upon value within the economy. But it's based on, theoretically at least, until you get to the fiscal economy, it's based on real work, on actual energy. Someone had to eat, invest in themselves, eat, sleep, take time, use their time and their energy to create that product. All right, there's been a lot of investment by that person into that product or service. Okay, and then there are layers to that: employers, employees, contractors, and so on and so on. But employment isn't quite what we think it is. Certainly not in terms of the way that governments and society as a result, governments have presented it to us, and society as a result has assumed about work. One of the things that's the big factors we need to think about is full employment. We always hear about full employment. We're working towards full employment. We have nearly full employment. Arguably, we haven't had full employment ever. There's never been a time in modern history where any country had full employment. It just doesn't. It doesn't exist. It doesn't happen. Even during World War II in the United States, which had millions of men at war, more working in factories, there's such shortages they had to work women in the factories and women through a whole range of jobs, which later completely changed the society for the better. They still had 1.2% unemployment. There are always people who cannot work. Simple as that. And there are always people who miss out. Between 1950 and 1974, in both Australia and in the United States and the UK and elsewhere overseas, it ranged from 2 to 3%. Australia was 2%. We had only 2% unemployment, but we had 2% unemployment. Two out of every 100 didn't work. Okay, and these aren't old people and children. These are working age people. Okay, this is how the statistics were collected. They weren't dummies even back then. Okay, so working age people who should have been capable of working, but for whatever reason couldn't get work. So even during times of incredible lateral and upward mobility and lateral mobility from one job to the other, there was still a percentage of people who had trouble getting work, who weren't crippled, who weren't disabled, who weren't children, and they weren't too old, but simply there wasn't always work in their particular area, because as we've seen, unemployment has gone in Australia in the last few years. It can be as low as 4.1 and as high as 7.9, and that's an official employment rate, which most people in most countries know are total bullshit. Highly confected figures that remove a whole bunch of unemployed people who aren't included in the figures, but we'll come to that later. So, I mean, you've got such enormous variance. There are parts of the country, parts of the UK and Spain, for example, and certainly regional Australia, where unemployment levels are over 20%. And we're not talking about like podunk towns. We're talking about cities of 20 to 100,000, which have unemployment levels between 12 and 20%. This is all over the world. So the concept of full employment or near full employment, it's bullshit. It doesn't exist. It never has. Even during the biggest booms of human history, we've never been able to give everyone a full-time job or even a part-time job at that. There's always been a percentage of people who couldn't work, who couldn't get work, weren't in the right spot at the right time or have the right skill sets, and they missed out. Not everyone gets to come to the party, and that's something that we need to acknowledge. We need to know that as a part of if we want to understand what's coming down the pipe for us. So, the typical person on Main Street, the idea of full employment means everyone in the country is working, which, a jobless rate of zero. Well, we know now that doesn't exist. It's a complete rubbish. So we've gone through some of those stats, and we've looked at. Let me just move this slightly, so I can adjust my chair a bit. So we've looked at the concept of full unemployment, and that even though governments talk about getting unemployment down, getting full unemployment, it's impossible. And through most of human history, most countries range between 2 and 5%. The average for Australia since the late 70s into 80s has been about 6% on average. Now it goes a bit lower, and it goes somewhat higher. It's been as high as 8 point something percent during the second to last recession, sort of 89 to 93. But generally, it sort of hovers between 3.5% and 5.5%, 6%. So it can be seen as when we lose employment, when employment gets worse, like it has lately, it's like the loss of a public asset. It's like value. It's like gold collapsing, and you've got all your money sunk in gold. We tend to see unemployment in a very personal sense, like it's the loss of our employment. It's much, much more than that. It's more than our personal disaster. It's a fundamental decoupling between the ability of labour, that's pretty much all of us, to access the economy. If you can't access the economy via some form of work or labour, you can't access the money that's in the economy being generated. Now, previously, most people needed to work and have in order to access that economy. So it was always a minority of people who were influenced by that scarcity of work. But when we have recessions, there's a drop. There's a break in the normal pattern of employment. And we go from a non-accelerating inflation rate, or it's called NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of employment, to an accelerated inflation rate of employment. And that's usually created by these kinds of, punctuated equilibrium events where, bang, you get a pandemic, big rock falls in the ocean and floods half a dozen countries, disease sweeps the planet, or a war, a massive war involving dozens of nations. These things do happen periodically, and when they do, they create enormous havoc, and they have huge influences on the economy. So, two massive technologies sweeping the world: the printing press, the assembly line, contraceptive pill, lots and lots of things, and they changed the world almost overnight, radically, in a whole variety of ways, including ways we didn't ever anticipate. So, recessions have permanent effects on the sectoral composition of the economy, and that means that the economy is divided up into sectors, and each of those sectors is impacted by recessionary impacts. And no recession is exactly the same, because each recession is driven by certain unique aspects in terms of not only usually the fiscal malfeasance that leads to it, but also policies. There was a stark difference between the GFC, which was largely the result of hyper-optimism and hyper-aggressive policies to do with a whole range of fiscal mechanisms like derivatives and margin lending and so on, that people who were using those tools barely understood them or didn't, as was the case more often than not, and had a shockingly poor understanding of human nature and the way that things could go wrong. They were just super optimistic. But that's a kind of different to the savings and loan collapses in the United States in 87 and then the global recession that followed in 89 through to 93. They were fundamentally different. They didn't have the same causes. Globalization drove the recession in 89-90, the massive shift. I mean, we'd already seen it in the 70s, but there was a massive second wave shift of labour and production capacity to East Asia in particular, China, but elsewhere, and eventually India, Bangladesh and other countries in South Asia as well. And these changes are permanent. We've never seen those factories never came back. Those factories haven't come back. They might now, but that's in the second video. But they never come back. Women entered the workforce and changed the disposition of our universities, where now they dominate in terms of the numbers of people who are graduating from university. There's quite a few. It's like 20% more women than men. And that's an increasing rate too. Changes society, radical changes in the way society works and functions, both good and bad, with positive and negative effects. I mean, it's stupid to say this was a good change or this was a bad change. There are changes that have more positive effects than negative effects for the greatest number of people. There are changes that have tremendous positive effects for some sets of people, some sectors, well, devastating on others. Okay, they're not good or bad. They are what they are. Nonetheless, that pursuit for cheap labour, that pursuit for lowering production costs and ramping up production capacities cheaply, quickly, was what drove the last big changes in society. The new international division of labour, flooding to the east. Most of our production capacity heading to Asia and India. That changed everything. It dramatically changed everything. And even though there were some big changes, personal computers and computer technology enabled people to take on new jobs. We had a massive growth in the number of people becoming university graduates. It wasn't enough to offset some of the permanent sectoral unemployment that was created by the last couple of recessions. And we saw unemployment rates that were sort of, 1.5 to 2.5% rise starkly in the early 90s to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% at one point in Australia. 8%. Some countries got higher, got to 10 in Europe, in multiple countries. And then they crested down a little bit, but we were sold a bill of goods there. Unemployment never really recovered. It never really descended back to the sort of the 5 to 6% we've all gotten used to, so 4% in some areas, but on average 5.5 to 6%. That most countries have gotten used to, including Australia. It never really went down that low. What happened was they started to fudge the figures. They started to change definitions. I mean, if you can't cure a problem, define it out of existence. That's easy to do, okay? Why actually solve a problem? Why invest money? Why listen to smarter people than yourself and do the hard work when you can just baffle everyone with bullshit? And that's precisely what they did. And I'm talking about not just Liberal Party. Everyone knows I favour the ALP and I favour the left, okay, in politics in general, not always. But both parties were guilty of it. Labor is guilty of it as anyone else. They are the ones ushered in globalisation into Australia, full-fledged. They tried to soften the blow as much as they could, and I give them props for that. But at the end of the day, there aren't any political parties with clean hands when it comes to the effects of globalisation. None. No one is innocent. And I don't know if anyone could have been innocent under the circumstances. Again, that's another video. Now, in most countries, including Australia and the US, the unemployment rate includes anyone who's 16 or older is actively searching for work. And that means students, retirees, and other people who haven't officially applied for work or have withdrawn from looking for work are excluded. So, already you've got millions of people in most per country who are, for want of a better word, are invisible to the unemployment figures. So already your unemployment figures are, somewhere from 10 to 30% out, at least. But then we have something else. We have deliberate fudging of figures. Before I go on to that, I want to revise this slightly. Our definitions of full employment and the way it's sold to us by these morally bankrupt public officials is inherently based on a willful promotion of a false public perception of what employment is, which we've already kind of talked about. In other words, full employment isn't when everyone has a job. It's when inflation starts to rise because businesses can't find enough workers, and that's sectorally related depending on which sector it is. It's a private sector measure for rising costs in the labour force, which gives you an idea of the priorities that governments have in using such language, because employment is defined even by governments in terms of how it influences business. Now, I kind of understand that we're a capitalist system. The private sector's raised billions out of poverty. It's done an awful lot of good and continues to do so. What worries me the most is when language is completely, not partly, not shared, but completely dominated by capitalist jargon. When it's completely dominated by business jargon, private sector definitions. So full unemployment is an issue not because it deprives families of the ability to access means of production, access services and goods and generate income. No. It's when it's getting too expensive for businesses to hire workers and they might go offshore. Oh, tax revenue fleeing the country. Now, I'm not saying that's not an issue. It is. But it's interesting to note that even the definitions of employment and unemployment that we have are not based upon humanity. They're not based upon what we need, the majority of us need. No. It's based upon what economic elites define as good and bad. That's an important one to remember as we continue this conversation and as you view the world from your own perspective. I want you to think about that. They don't look at us in the same way we look at ourselves, that's for sure. We're looked on more as resources than anything else. And we need to regard ourselves as resources as intelligent resources, hopefully, in order to reclaim our position there and maybe one day change some of that jargon and change some of those semantics to be a sort of a more balanced perspective on how things should be. Look, I'll do it country by country. Working people who are counted as unemployed, working people in the US, I think they've gotten as high as 7.6%. But realistically speaking, if you look at labour utilisation rates, which are the best rates, they usually count just those people that they're counting in their figures. So they won't count any students, no retirees, no one who's not registered as unemployed. They don't count people who work 1 to 4 hours, and that's multiple countries. It's not just Australia. You work 5 hours, even though you're receiving full dole in most countries for working under 10 hours a week or less. you're still counted as employed. Well, you're not. You're receiving somewhere from 60% to 100% of your welfare payment, your social security payment. Well, you're not employed then, are you? And they define underemployment as a sliding scale that starts from 1 hour a week up to, 35. So these definitions, and we find them in Canada, we find them in the US, we find them in Australia, UK, they hide a horrific picture of unemployment. Now, America had 3.9, they were arguing recently, 3.9 to 4.1. But in reality, if you count labour utilisation rates, like how many people of that age who are engaged in the economy could be engaged in the economy, all right, it's far higher than that. So once you factor in also that, people who are working less than about 25 hours a week are dependent on the social security systems of their countries to some degree, to a very high degree. You cannot count them as employed. And underemployed needs to be sat right next to unemployed on a continuum scale. And I don't think anyone who receives 30 or 40% of their income, let alone 50, 60 or more, as social security should be counted as employed. They're not. They're not. If you want to create a separate category, which they sort of have with the underemployed, then you've got to include that though. You've got to include that. But they don't. They're specious about it. They only have this very narrow definition of unemployment. And as a result, we are given a complete false idea about the numbers of people who struggle to find work in this country, quite legitimately. Certainly reliable work as well. So, America never got really below 7.6%, but they were lying about it. And in many parts of America, unemployment was over 20%. Canada's got similar issues. And at the end of 2017, the unemployment rate was claimed to be about 9.4%. It got pretty high at one point there, but estimates are that it was more like 14.2% using labour utilisation rates. It's definitely, at least currently now, by the same calculations, north of 13%, even though they're claiming they have under 8% unemployment. Their labour utilisation rate fell from 67.7%, that's the percentage of the population that are used, who can work, that are used, down to 65.4%. Again, these labour utilisation rates they tell a very different story, and they show us exactly what's happening in terms of the lies that we're told. The official unemployment rate in England was 4.2 in November. I think now it's 4.4%. It was until the COVID crisis, which has changed everything. With the true figures much higher, Hallam University found that a total number of unemployed in Britain was actually, at the time, 3.6 million in April of that year. But the labour force survey, from which official unemployment statistics derive, reported only 2.5 million. So already there's some, they report 2.5, but the source material says 3.4. So how the hell did that happen? How did they miss almost 1 million people? So that jumps their rate from 4.2, to 5.7%. And the hidden jobless, based on labour utilisation rates, jumps it from an estimate of working age people who are jobless, estimates the jump from 4.6 to 13.2%. Again, they're not telling the truth. The European Union reported an unofficial unemployment rate of 7.1%, with Greece having the highest at 20.8%. But a separately provided total for underemployed part-time workers and potential additional labour force ended up effectively doubling the true EU rate of unemployment. So it ended up being about 14%. We keep seeing this. There's a parity on these figures. Australia's unemployment rate is seasonally adjusted is about 5.6%, or was until about a month ago, according to our own Bureau of Statistics. But again, if we use extended labour force underutilisation figures, it ends up being about 15.4%. And it's not hard to work out when you realise that for, again, people here work 1 hour a week. 1 hour a week, they're considered employed. Even though they're receiving full dole and they're engaged in the same active job programs and they're under all the same mutual obligation scrutinies and so on and so on, they're considered employed because they work part-time. And they're not really, not by any reasonable, rational, economically sound means. Those people number in the millions. They're close to 2 million who work under 10 hours a week. If you go from 10 to 20 and they're still receiving health benefits and some government support, that's another 2 million. But estimates are between 1.3 and 2 million. It fluctuates. So you're talking about millions of people, a massive chunk of the workforce are underemployed, grossly underemployed in many cases, and are counted as employed when they really, really shouldn't be. And a massive chunk of the Social Security budget. So we have lie upon lie upon lie. It's clear that governments and their corporate classmates are content to grossly misrepresent the drop off in labour utilisation, which is the only way that anyone can financially benefit or fiscally contribute to the economy. They're quite happy to ignore it all and sell us a bill of goods in terms of unemployment figures. We haven't had high employment within our societies for decades. It has been substantially higher for decades than was acknowledged. And this COVID crisis is driving home the stake to the vampiric heart of our economy. And it's something that we're going to feel very strongly as automation and intelligent systems interpenetrate the economy at a rate that you will not believe until you see it. It's already started to happen. I mean, look at the smartphone in your hand. Look at all the things it does for you. Look at the incredible advances in voice-activated software, voice intelligence. And we all laugh about it, but it's getting good now. You can actually use it for a variety of things. Well, no one used that shit 5 years ago when it first came out. I remember 2013, 2014, 2015, Siri, the first series and stuff, they were dog shit. They were terrible.